Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Caravan of Entities. I was walking down Fifth Avenue, the bustling heart of New York, as the cool evening air brushed against my skin. The streets were crowded, people hurrying home after a long day, the usual clamor of the city filling the space around me. But for some reason, I felt out of sync with it all. The noises, the honking of taxis, the murmur of conversations, the clatter of footsteps seemed distant, as though they were happening somewhere far away, not right here, not in the middle of the sidewalk. It was subtle at first. A slight disorientation, a vague sense that something was off. I paused for a moment to take in the scene around me, hoping that maybe a breath of fresh air would shake off the discomfort that was settling in my chest. The lights from the billboards above flickered like they always did, casting their artificial glow over the street. Yet something didn't feel right. It wasn't the usual rush of the city, the familiar sense of being a part of something bigger, something alive. No, it felt like I was somehow outside of it all, a spectator rather than a participant. A wave of dizziness washed over me, like the ground beneath my feet wasn't as solid as it should be. I staggered slightly, gripping the edge of a nearby lamppost to steady myself. A few pedestrians glanced at me, but they didn't seem to notice the strange haze that clouded my senses. I shook my head, trying to clear it, but the feeling lingered. Could I be sick? I thought it over. No, I wasn't ill. I'd been fine all day, well rested, and eaten lunch just a few hours ago. Maybe it was just fatigue, the weight of a long week catching up to me. I tried to laugh it off, but the unease wouldn't leave. It crept under my skin, making me aware of every little sound, every movement, every person who brushed past me. The whispers of conversation in the distance now sounded garbled, out of sync, as if the words were being spoken underwater. I looked around, but the faces of those around me were a blur. Not unusual for a busy street, but it added to the odd sensation that I wasn't fully in the moment. And then it hit me. There was a faint sound, just on the edge of hearing, like the wind carrying voices. The hum of the city had always had a rhythm, a constant pulse that made it feel alive, but this sound, it didn't belong. It was softer, deeper, almost like a whisper, but there was no one close enough to be speaking. No one was walking beside me, no one was in front of me. The sound felt distant, yet, at the same time, it seemed to be coming from everywhere, all around me. I quickened my pace, my heart rate picking up without warning. Was it just my imagination? I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone there, a shadowy figure walking in step with me, but there was nothing. Just the usual crowd. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I tried to focus on the sounds I knew, the rhythm of my shoes against the pavement, the laughter of a group of teenagers nearby, the blare of a car horn in the distance, but it all felt muffled, as if the world itself was growing distant, like I was slipping into some other space. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and pushed forward, desperate to find some sense of normalcy in the chaos of the city. But as I did, the whispering sound grew louder, more distinct. It was no longer just the wind or the traffic, it was a presence, one that I couldn't see, but that I could feel. My skin prickled, a cold shiver running down my spine. Something wasn't right. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure if I was still part of the world I had always known. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was just the city playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The streets grew quieter as I continued walking, the sounds of the city muffled by an unnatural heaviness that seemed to hang in the air. The further I went, the more I felt as though the city was changing around me. The lights were too bright, the shadows too deep. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking behind me, but there was only the usual crowd of pedestrians. And then I saw them. A group of people moving slowly across the street, almost in sync with each other. They didn't look like the usual late-night strollers or workers heading home. They looked wrong. There were no hurried steps, no bustling rush. They didn't seem to care about where they were going or who was around them. They just moved forward, a strange, almost mechanical rhythm in their steps. The group was small, maybe 5 or 6 people, but they stood out against the typical crowd, not just because of the oddness in their movement, but because of the way they appeared. At first, I couldn't place what made them so unusual. It wasn't their clothes, though they were dressed in dark, almost indistinguishable clothing, blending with the night. It wasn't their posture either, though they walked with an unsettling lack of urgency, as if they were simply floating rather than moving. No, it was something more subtle, something about their presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. They didn't make a sound. No footsteps, no rustling of clothing, no breath. As though the very air around them was holding its breath, refusing to acknowledge them. I stopped in my tracks. The group didn't seem to notice me. They just kept walking, their faces blank, their eyes fixed straight ahead, not a single glance to the side. Each one seemed lost in their own world, completely detached from everything around them. Their movements were too synchronized, too precise. It was as if they were part of something bigger, something I couldn't see, yet couldn't escape. One of them was a man, tall, with a gaunt face, his skin unnaturally pale under the streetlights. His eyes were sunken, hollow, like deep pools of black ink. He wasn't looking at anyone, but somehow, I felt his gaze cut through me, cold and knowing. I tried to take a step back, to move to the side and avoid them, but my legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the spot. My heartbeat quickened, and I could feel the cold creeping up my spine. The man, no, the thing, continued to walk toward me, its eyes never leaving me, its pace never faltering. For a brief moment, I thought about calling out, yelling for someone to notice, to help. But I couldn't. My throat felt tight, constricted, as though the very act of speaking would shatter the fragile bubble of normalcy that was still clinging to my mind. The others in the group continued walking in silence, their expressions unreadable, their faces mere masks of indifference. But as they passed, I could feel something else, something dark, something that wasn't just the chill in the air. It was like a presence that seeped into my skin, filling me with a strange, draining weight. It was as though they were sucking the very energy from the space around them, pulling everything into themselves, leaving only emptiness in their wake. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I should have turned around. I should have run. But I couldn't. My body refused to obey. As they passed me, I felt a strange, sharp pain in my chest, like something had pierced through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I gasped for air, as though something was squeezing the life out of me. The group moved on, fading into the shadows of the street, and I was left standing there, gasping, feeling my strength drain away. My legs wobbled beneath me, and I barely caught myself on a nearby lamp post, my hand gripping it tightly as if it might anchor me to reality. I looked around, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The city seemed unchanged, the people around me oblivious to what I had just witnessed. No one else had noticed them. No one else had seen the strange procession moving through the night. But I had. And now, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if they had noticed me. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that was clouding my thoughts. The figures, the procession, had disappeared into the night, leaving nothing behind but a lingering coldness that seemed to have settled deep into my bones. I stood there, frozen for what felt like an eternity, my breath shallow and quick. It was ridiculous, right? I had just seen something, someone strange, but I was still in New York. A city of thousands of people, where strange things happen all the time. Perhaps I had just imagined it. The fatigue, the dizzy spell earlier, maybe it was all just some strange combination of stress and my own mind playing tricks on me. I tried to take a deep breath, telling myself that I was being irrational. This wasn't a horror story. I wasn't about to be sucked into some supernatural nightmare. No. It was just late, I was tired, and the city sometimes had a way of getting under your skin when you weren't paying attention. But the unease in my chest wouldn't fade. It was still there, gnawing at me, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me that something wasn't right. Something wasn't normal. I looked around again. The street was bustling, as it always did at this hour, but it felt like I was seeing it through a foggy lens. People walked by, oblivious to everything, caught up in their own lives, their own worlds. I envied them for it. Their normalcy. Their lack of awareness. Still, I kept walking, hoping that the movement would shake the strange weight that had settled on me. The further I went, the more I felt it, the tightness in my chest, the sense of something missing from my body. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was like a piece of me was gone. I reached up, rubbing my temple, trying to push through the sudden pressure building behind my eyes. A headache. Just a headache, I told myself. I was overreacting. But it wasn't just a headache. It was weaker. My limbs felt sluggish, like I had been awake for days, not just hours. The once familiar pulse of my heartbeat felt distant, like I was watching someone else's life unfold, detached from my own body. I stumbled slightly as I walked, catching myself against a nearby storefront window. I leaned against it for a moment, pressing my hand to the glass, trying to steady myself. The world outside felt too far away, as though I was peering into someone else's reality, something that wasn't meant for me. The city, the people, the cars, the bright lights, felt both too close and too distant at the same time. I breathed in deeply, my chest aching with the effort. The sharpness in my lungs made me cough, and as I did, I felt a strange, cold rush flood my body. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was as if the energy, the life, was draining from me. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, I felt the weight of it. At first, I had thought it was just my mind, playing tricks, telling me I was tired, telling me I was imagining things. But now it was undeniable. I was weaker. I pulled my hand from the window, letting it fall to my side, my fingers trembling slightly. The cold sensation had spread, creeping down my arms and into my chest. The figures. The procession. Was it them? Was this some kind of consequence, some unseen toll for encountering them in the street? A shiver ran down my spine, but it wasn't the cold night air, it was something else, something that I couldn't shake. I had seen them. I had felt them. And now, I was paying the price. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but the nagging sensation kept growing, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. My legs felt weak, as though they might give way at any moment, and I had to force myself to keep moving, to keep walking, even though every step felt heavier than the last. The sounds of the city, once so familiar, felt muted now. The usual noise of horns and chatter seemed to fade into the background, like I was hearing everything underwater. The lights from the street lamps flickered as I passed, casting strange shadows on the ground, distorting the shapes of the buildings around me. I wasn't just tired. I was drained. I stopped for a moment, standing still in the middle of the street, trying to ground myself, trying to steady my racing thoughts. But the sensation only grew stronger, more intense. My heart pounded in my chest, but it felt slow, sluggish, like it was struggling to keep up with the demands of my body. There had to be an explanation. There had to be something logical, something rational that I could hold on to, something that could pull me back from this creeping, suffocating feeling. But the more I tried to reason with myself, the more I realized how futile it was. The more I realized that something was happening, something wrong. And it was happening to me. I wasn't imagining it. And I wasn't going to get away from it. I had to keep moving. That was the only thing I could think of. Walking, pushing forward, trying to outrun this feeling, this heaviness that was settling into my bones. I couldn't explain it, but the sensation of being drained, of losing something vital, was growing stronger with each step I took. My legs felt weaker, like they might collapse under me any moment. And yet, I couldn't stop. I couldn't let myself stand still, not even for a moment. As I stumbled forward, trying to make sense of what was happening, a strange, cold draft brushed against my face. I looked up instinctively, my breath hitching in my throat. He was standing there, just a few feet in front of me. It was one of them. One of the figures from the procession. His presence was impossible to ignore. He was tall, thin, too thin, and his face was as pale as moonlight, with deep, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. His clothing was dark, blending seamlessly into the night, but his eyes, they were the only thing I could focus on. His gaze locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade into the background. Everything else, all the noise, all the people, vanished, leaving only the two of us standing there in the empty street. I wanted to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, rooted to the spot by something deeper than fear. Something older, something that twisted my insides. His eyes, cold and empty, seemed to draw me in, pulling at me like I was a thread and he was the needle, sewing me into his world. "Help me," I wanted to say, but no words came. My throat was tight, as if a heavy weight was pressing against it, making it impossible to speak. All I could do was stand there, staring into his eyes, feeling the weight of his presence envelop me. He didn't speak, not a word. His lips didn't even move. And yet, I felt his gaze shift, a strange understanding passing between us, like he knew exactly what I was feeling, exactly what was happening to me. Suddenly, he took a step forward. I felt it before I saw it, his hand reaching toward me. Slowly, deliberately, like he knew that every motion would send a shock through my system. He didn't touch me in the way a person might, with warmth or intent. No, this was something else. It was as though he was pulling me in, drawing me closer, not physically, but with a force that made my chest tighten and my pulse quicken. His fingers brushed against my arm, and that's when it happened. The moment his skin made contact with mine, it felt like something inside me snapped. The cold surged through my body, a freezing sensation that sank deep into my core, as if my very energy, my life, was being siphoned away. The force was so sudden, so intense, that I couldn't even react. It was like an invisible drain opening inside me, sucking at everything I had, leaving only an aching emptiness in its wake. I gasped, my breath hitching as the energy drained from me. It wasn't just physical. It was mental, emotional. I could feel it, this overwhelming sense of exhaustion, of being pulled into a dark void. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. The world around me was spinning, blurring at the edges as though I was slipping out of it. His touch was light, almost delicate, but the effect was devastating. He didn't push me away, didn't force me to bend. It was as though he didn't need to do anything but touch me, and the rest of it would happen on its own. The cold deepened. My legs trembled beneath me, and I could barely hold myself upright. It felt like every cell in my body was being drained, one by one. The exhaustion was overwhelming. It wasn't the kind of tiredness that comes from lack of sleep, it was something much deeper, more fundamental. It was as if my very soul was being drained. I tried to pull away, to break free from his touch, but my body wouldn't respond. I could feel the last of my strength being sucked out of me, the weight of his touch anchoring me in place, holding me there, suspended in that moment of pure terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, he released me. The emptiness inside me remained. The coldness lingered, like a phantom that wouldn't leave, but the pressure on my chest, the draining force, ceased. I stumbled back, nearly collapsing to the ground as the world slowly began to right itself again. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The man, the thing, simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me gasping for breath, my body trembling from the experience. My knees buckled, and I barely managed to catch myself on a nearby wall. I slid down it, my back against the cold brick, trying to steady my breath. The dizziness was overwhelming, and every fiber of my being screamed for rest, for escape. But as I sat there, gasping, trying to collect myself, one thought kept circling in my mind: it's not over. Whatever had just happened wasn't over. It was just beginning. And I was not ready for it. I leaned against the cold brick wall, my hands shaking as I tried to steady myself. The streets were still alive with the hum of the city, the usual bustle of late-night traffic and the murmur of passing strangers, but it felt like I was in a different world. A world that didn't make sense. A world that was breaking apart piece by piece. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of the touch, of that coldness that had seeped into my bones. My mind raced, desperately searching for an explanation. There has to be a logical explanation, I told myself. I just had to think. I had to stay calm. If I could just calm down, then I could figure this out. But every time I tried to focus, a wave of dizziness would wash over me. I took deep breaths, tried to ground myself, but it was like the air had thickened, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. The world around me spun in slow circles, and I had to clutch the wall to keep from falling. My head felt like it was going to split open. It wasn't real, I told myself. This couldn't be happening. I had to be imagining it, or there was something wrong with me. I hadn't been sleeping well lately. Maybe I was just exhausted, too many late nights, too much work, too many stressors. My body was playing tricks on me. My mind was playing tricks on me. I looked around at the people walking by, their faces blurred in the dim streetlight. No one seemed to notice. No one seemed to care. They just kept going about their lives, completely oblivious to the strange, terrifying thing I had just experienced. Was I the only one who had seen them? The figures, the procession, the pale man with the hollow eyes, the draining cold that had seeped into my very soul. I could still feel it, deep inside me, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. But it wasn't possible. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened in real life. This was madness. This was fear. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I had to be rational. If I could just make sense of it, if I could prove to myself that it wasn't real, that it wasn't happening, then I could go back to normal. I could go home, fall asleep, wake up tomorrow, and everything would be fine. It's just stress, I told myself. You're tired. You're hallucinating. You've been working too much, staying up late. But then I remembered the cold. The touch. It was too real. Too physical. I closed my eyes tightly, gritting my teeth. I needed answers. I needed to know what was happening, why I was feeling like this, why everything around me seemed to have shifted into something wrong. I stood up straighter, taking a shaky step away from the wall, forcing myself to keep moving. I needed to get somewhere. I needed to think. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my body was exhausted, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I told myself that, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. The fear kept clawing at me, sharp and unrelenting, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I tried to think about it logically. Maybe I had stumbled into something that I didn't understand. People talk about strange things happening in the city all the time, urban legends, ghost stories, things that happen in the dark corners of places you never look. Maybe that's all this was. Some sort of ghostly procession, a phenomenon that people had witnessed for years but never talked about. Maybe I had just found it. But if that were true, why did it feel like I was the only one who could see it? I paused at the corner, looking down the street. People passed by, oblivious. Some were talking on their phones, others laughing, a group of friends huddling together, but no one seemed out of place. No one seemed affected. I felt a chill run down my spine again. It wasn't the kind of chill you get on a cold night, it was something else. Something internal. Something wrong. The coldness was inside me now, seeping through my veins, spreading through my limbs, settling deep into my chest. My mind couldn't keep up. I wanted to scream, to shout, to make it stop. But all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, by confusion. I thought about what had happened, the man, the touch, the drain. But how could that be real? How could it be happening? It wasn't possible. It wasn't rational. Nothing in my life had ever prepared me for something like this. It's not real, I told myself. It's just fear. Just your mind. You're stressed, tired, nothing more. But the whisper of doubt lingered in my mind, echoing with each step I took. Every part of me was screaming for an explanation, but there was no simple answer. There was nothing to hold on to. The world around me continued on, unchanged, unaffected. But inside, everything was different. I felt alien to myself. The exhaustion, the fear, the confusion, it was all too much. And as much as I tried to push it all away, the deeper I fell into it, the more I realized I didn't know what was happening. And the more I didn't know, the more the fear seemed to consume me. I had to try. I had to force myself to keep going. No matter what had happened last night, no matter the cold, the figures, the draining touch, I couldn't let it control me. Life had to go on. I couldn't let fear dictate every step I took. So, I woke up this morning like any other day, or at least, I tried to. I dragged myself out of bed, the weight of the night's events still pressing on me like an invisible hand. The light coming through the window was soft, ordinary, nothing about the world had changed, not on the surface. But the tension, it was there. It was suffocating. I went through the motions, brushing my teeth, getting dressed, eating a quick breakfast. I kept telling myself that everything was fine. I was fine. It was just a bad dream, just a trick of my mind. I had to push it aside. But the tension in my body wouldn't let up. Every step I took felt like I was walking on eggshells, like something was about to crack beneath me. The weight of it all was so subtle, but it built with each passing moment. As I walked to the subway station, the noise of the city, usually comforting, familiar, seemed amplified, too sharp, too intrusive. The honking horns, the murmur of voices, the click of footsteps, it all felt like it was closing in, like the city itself was tightening its grip around me. I tried to ignore it, tried to push it to the back of my mind. I told myself that I was just paranoid. But with every step, every sound, it felt like the air itself was thickening, pressing down on me. As I boarded the subway, the crowded car felt like a cage. I squeezed into a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible, hoping the throngs of people would drown out the anxiety creeping through me. But I couldn't escape it. The feeling that something was wrong. The certainty that something was watching, something was waiting just beyond my sight. I glanced around at the other passengers, their faces indifferent, lost in their own worlds. No one seemed to notice the tension, the strange weight hanging in the air. How could they not feel it? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to look out the window as the train sped through the dark tunnels. The flickering lights outside cast long shadows that danced on the walls of the car, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move. A figure, just on the edge of my vision, slipping in and out of the darkness. I blinked hard, shaking my head. It was nothing. Just a trick of the light. But the feeling of something was still there, gnawing at the back of my mind. Every time the train passed through a tunnel, the lights would flicker and the shadows would stretch, distorting the space around me. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching from the edges of those flickering shadows, lurking just beyond the light. When I finally stepped off the train, the weight of the air didn't lift. It clung to me like a thick fog that I couldn't escape. The streets of the city were bustling as usual, people walking, cars passing, the hum of everyday life, but the world felt different. Everything felt out of sync, like I was trapped in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. My own footsteps echoed too loudly in my ears as I walked, the rhythm of my movement matching the pounding in my chest. With each stride, the pressure built. I could feel it now, in my bones, in the pit of my stomach, the sensation of something following. Watching. Waiting. I quickened my pace, hoping to outrun it, but no matter how fast I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling. The shadows around me seemed deeper now, more ominous. Even the sunlight felt cold, harsh. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, there, just beyond the corner of my vision. I couldn't do this. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. The world around me was changing, and I was powerless to stop it. I turned a corner and saw a familiar street ahead, one that I always took to get home. But today, it looked different. The buildings, the people walking by, the streetlights, they all seemed farther away, as though I were seeing them through a haze. The world felt distant, alien, as if it was slipping just out of reach, out of my control. Every step felt heavy now. Every corner I turned, every street I crossed, felt like a countdown. The feeling of tension was building inside me, pressing tighter and tighter with each passing second. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, as though my body knew what was coming before my mind did. It was like I was being pulled along by an invisible force, like the city itself was a living thing, and I was its prey. I reached the entrance to my apartment building and paused for a moment, the door looming before me like the threshold to some unknown place. I stood there, my hand on the door handle, heart pounding, my mind screaming for me to stop, to turn around, to run. But I couldn't. I couldn't run forever. So, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, hoping, praying, that once I was behind the safety of these walls, the weight, the tension, the fear would finally lift. But even as the door clicked shut behind me, the feeling stayed. It was still there. And I realized, with a sinking feeling in my stomach, that I wasn't sure if I could escape it anymore. I spent the next few days trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But the cracks were starting to show, and no matter how hard I tried to deny it, the world around me had begun to warp in ways I couldn't explain. It started with the shadows. I was walking home from the store one evening, the sun just dipping below the horizon, leaving behind a fading streak of orange across the sky. The streetlights were flickering on, casting pools of yellow light along the sidewalks. The city felt quieter now, almost too quiet. The usual hum of cars and people had died down, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful, almost soothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I walked, I noticed the shadows stretching unnaturally long on the pavement. They moved in ways that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was just the shifting light, the way the lampposts flickered, creating odd angles and distortions. But then I saw it again, at the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't follow the shape of the person it belonged to. A shadow that lingered even after the person had passed. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I looked up. There was no one else around. The street was empty, save for a few stray pedestrians ahead of me. I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the sidewalk, watching the shadows twist and bend in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I shook my head, trying to clear the confusion. It's just the lights, I told myself. You're just tired. Just seeing things. But the unease gnawed at me. The shadows didn't make sense. And as I watched, one of them seemed to stretch toward me, its dark form lengthening across the pavement like fingers reaching for my feet. I took a step back. It wasn't the light. It wasn't my mind. I turned quickly, forcing myself to walk faster, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadows seemed to follow me, twisting at the edges of my vision, flickering just out of my reach, always a few steps behind. The air felt colder now, the evening breeze turning to a chill that cut through my jacket and sent shivers down my spine. But it wasn't just the temperature. It was wrong. It felt like the air was alive, a presence moving around me, circling, brushing against my skin. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel like it belonged. The gusts came from nowhere, sharp and sudden, and they didn't carry the usual smell of the city, no exhaust, no food vendors. Instead, it was a dry, empty chill, like the wind had come from someplace far beyond this world. It pulled at my clothes, tugging my sleeves back as if trying to pull me deeper into the street. I froze, looking around. There were people walking past me, oblivious to the strange cold, their jackets and coats failing to shield them from the same wind I was feeling. It didn't make sense. It wasn't normal. I had to get home. I had to get somewhere safe. I quickened my pace, the cold wind continuing to whip around me, but it felt like something was dragging at my back. The shadows seemed to reach for me with every step I took, stretching and shifting, always just on the edge of my vision. I could hear them, too, the rustling sound of movement behind me, faint, like a whisper, but too close. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street was still empty. I was losing it. I knew I was losing it. But the chill remained, and the shadows followed. I reached the corner of my street and turned quickly, nearly stumbling as I pressed myself against the brick of the building. The familiar sights of home should have been a comfort, but they only made everything worse. It was as if I had stepped into a different world, a place where everything was slightly wrong, just enough to make me question everything. I reached the door to my building, but when I pulled on the handle, it felt colder than it should have been, like it hadn't been touched in days. I hurried inside, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The hallway was dark. Too dark. The flickering light above me cast long shadows along the walls, and I could hear the hum of the elevator in the distance, faint and mechanical. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm my breathing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the cold, the shadows, they were still there, just beyond the threshold. I moved toward the stairs, but the sound of something shifting caught my attention. The air felt even colder now, as though the entire building had become a vacuum, drawing all warmth out of the space around me. I glanced up, and there, at the far end of the hallway, I saw a shape. A shadow. It wasn't one of the usual, harmless ones. This was different. This one was too solid. For a moment, I stood frozen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The shadow was still for a second, and then it shifted. It moved, not with the pace of a person walking, but as if it were waiting, aware. I took a step back, but the air was so thick now, I couldn't breathe properly. I felt the weight of it pressing on me, like I was being smothered by something just beyond my understanding. And then, as I took another step, the shadow moved again. It was no longer just a shadow. It was something else. Something alive. I turned and ran up the stairs, the sound of my feet pounding against the steps the only thing I could hear. And with every step, the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, pulling at my heels. The cold clung to me like an unseen hand, and I knew without a doubt that I wasn't alone. And whatever was out there, it was following me. I stood in my apartment, staring at the walls as the evening light faded into the night. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment, their shapes warping and twisting as if they were alive. I had locked the door, double-checked the windows, but none of that mattered. The oppressive weight in the air hadn't lifted. The chill lingered, pressing against my skin like an invisible presence. I should have felt safe here. Safe from whatever was out there, following me. But the truth was, I was more afraid now than I had been on the street. In my own home, where I should have found solace, I only found dread. I couldn't stop replaying what had happened. The shadows. The cold. The whispers that seemed to grow louder with every step I took. There had to be some logical explanation. I had to find one. I sat down on my couch, trying to steady my breathing, forcing myself to think clearly. There had to be a reason for all of this. A scientific reason. Something that made sense. Maybe it was just stress. Maybe I was overworking myself, pushing too hard. My mind had been running 100 miles a minute the past few days, trying to catch up with everything that had happened. Maybe the fatigue was playing tricks on me. But the wind, that unnatural chill that couldn't be explained away by stress. And the shadows? No, I knew what I had seen. I rubbed my temples, trying to sort through the fog in my mind. Was it a fever dream? I had felt sick when I first noticed the processions in the street. Could this all be some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion? No, that didn't feel right either. The details, the clarity of the fear, it was too real. Too consistent. The shadows, no! They weren't a trick of my mind. I had seen them shift in ways that defied reason. No flickering streetlight or angle of view could explain that. It was as if the darkness itself had developed a mind of its own, bending and stretching, following me, reaching for me. I stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. The shadows followed my every movement, their edges growing more pronounced as the apartment grew darker. The longer I stayed still, the stronger the feeling became, the sensation of something watching me, just beyond my reach. Something waiting. I thought about the people I had seen in the procession. The way they moved, too uniform, too unnatural. The coldness that had washed over me when I passed through them, the strange sensation of something leaving me. They weren't just people. They couldn't have been. No human would have made me feel the way I had felt in their presence. I paused near the window, looking out at the dimly lit streets below. The lights in the city flickered, casting faint, disjointed shadows against the buildings. Were they out there again? Were the figures still walking those streets, following the same pattern, draining the same energy from anyone who came near? It didn't make sense. None of it did. And the more I tried to explain it away, the more I felt like I was losing myself. Every explanation I came up with felt weak, flimsy, compared to the reality of what I had experienced. What I had felt. Could it all be some kind of mass delusion? Some shared panic triggered by the city's stresses? No, I couldn't convince myself of that either. The fear I felt wasn't just in my head, it was physical, crawling beneath my skin, tightening around my chest. And then there was the touch. The man from the procession, the way his hand had lingered on my arm, like a cold, draining force pulling something from me. I sank down onto the couch, my hands trembling in my lap. It was too much. There had to be an answer, a rational explanation, but with every passing moment, it felt more and more like I was chasing shadows. I was becoming consumed by something I couldn't explain, something I couldn't even define. And the worst part was, I knew it was coming. Whatever it was, whatever they were, it wasn't finished with me. The figures in the street, the shadows that reached for me, the cold that I couldn't shake, it was only the beginning. Something was happening. Something bigger. Something I couldn't stop, couldn't escape. I stood up and walked to the small mirror above the hallway table. I stared at my reflection, the dim light casting a pale glow across my face. I looked different. Hollow, somehow. The eyes staring back at me seemed distant, lost in thought. And I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen before. There was a faint shadow beneath my eyes, darker than the usual weariness. As if I had aged a year in the span of a few hours. What was happening to me? I turned away from the mirror, not able to bear looking at myself anymore. The fear, the cold, the shadows, they were taking root inside me, and I couldn't stop it. I wasn't just afraid of the things outside my door. I was afraid of what was happening inside me. I could feel it now, deep in my bones, the slow, steady drain. The life, the energy, slipping away from me, piece by piece. I had to find answers. I had to know what was happening before it was too late. But with every question I asked, I was no closer to finding the truth. Each time I tried to explain it, I found myself farther from any answer that made sense. The more I thought about it, the more the walls seemed to close in around me, and I knew that whatever I was facing, it was much bigger than I could handle. And time was running out. It had been days since the shadows first started following me. Days since the cold air began to cling to my skin, as though the very atmosphere around me was tightening, pulling me into a space I couldn't escape. I tried to find some sort of solace in the familiar, home, work, the people I interacted with, but everywhere I went, the unease crept in like a dark cloud I couldn't shake. The feeling of being watched never left. The shadows continued to stretch in unnatural ways, the wind howling with an eerie, otherworldly force. The world was out of balance, and I was beginning to feel like I was losing my place in it. But it wasn't just me. I realized it one afternoon when I was at the corner cafe, trying to force down a coffee that tasted like cardboard. I had been sitting there for an hour, staring at the screen of my phone, scrolling through mindless news articles, trying to distract myself from the thoughts circling my head. People walked in and out of the cafe, going about their business, but I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the windows, watching the street outside, half expecting to see the same procession I'd seen days ago. That's when I overheard it. A hushed conversation from the table next to mine. Two women, mid-conversation, speaking in low tones as if afraid to be heard. "You felt it too, right?" the first woman asked, her voice trembling slightly. The second woman looked over her shoulder before answering, as though checking if anyone could hear. "Yes. I thought I was going crazy. I thought it was just me, but it's real, isn't it?" I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the words caught me off guard. It's real. What was real? What were they talking about? The first woman nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on her coffee cup. I didn't want to say anything. I've seen people walking in the streets, but they're not right. They move like shadows. And the cold, it's like it's following me. It feels wrong. I froze. I had to hear more. The second woman looked around again, making sure no one was listening, before leaning in. I thought I was just tired at first, or maybe just imagining things. But no. It's real. I've seen them. Just like you said, the people walking like they don't belong. They feel wrong. And the cold, it's worse than ever. I've felt it in my apartment, in the hallways. It's everywhere. The words sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just me. There were others. Others who were feeling this too, this thing that had been haunting me for days, the very thing that I couldn't explain, the thing I had been too scared to speak aloud. I couldn't help myself. I leaned slightly forward, trying to catch more of the conversation, my heart racing as I clung to every word. The idea that I wasn't alone in this, was it comforting or terrifying? Maybe both. Maybe if there were others who saw what I saw, we could make sense of it together. Or maybe we'd all be drawn into whatever this thing was, like helpless marionettes tangled in a web. The first woman continued, her voice shaky. I don't know what to do. Every time I step outside, I see them. Just standing there, watching. But they don't move like regular people. They move like shadows, like they're not fully there. Exactly, the second woman whispered. And I feel like I'm fading. Like something's draining me every time I get close to them. I don't know if I can take it much longer. I keep telling myself I'm just imagining it. That it's my mind playing tricks, but it's not. I feel it. I feel it getting worse. My mind raced. They were describing the exact same thing I had felt. The same cold. The same shadows. The same feeling of being drained, of something slowly stealing the energy right from my body. I opened my mouth to speak, to say something, to ask them if they knew anything more, anything that could help me understand, but then I stopped myself. I hesitated. I didn't want to seem crazy. There was a part of me that wanted to yell at them, to tell them to stop whispering about this like it was some sort of secret, but I couldn't. What if they had the same doubts I did? What if they felt as powerless as I did in the face of whatever was happening? The fear was palpable in their voices, and I could see it in their eyes as they exchanged glances, their bodies shifting uncomfortably in their seats, as if trying to keep the truth hidden from the rest of the world. I sat there for what felt like hours, pretending to sip my coffee, but my mind was elsewhere, caught between the horror of this shared experience and the overwhelming desire to confront it. Eventually, the conversation died down. The two women stood, each leaving the cafe as quietly as they had come, their heads down, their shoulders tense, as though trying to avoid notice. I stayed seated, my coffee untouched. My mind was reeling. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining it. But that only made it worse. Now I knew that what I was experiencing wasn't just a figment of my mind. It wasn't some personal hallucination. There was something out there. Something unnatural. And it was not only affecting me. I didn't know how much longer I could go on pretending that I was the only one who felt it. But there was something even more unsettling about all of this. They were afraid to talk about it. They were afraid of admitting what they saw. Why? Were they afraid of drawing attention to it? Or was it something more? Something deeper? Something about it felt like a warning. Like it wasn't just the shadows that we should fear, but what would happen if we let ourselves admit the truth. And I was starting to wonder how many others had seen it too. The more I tried to gather myself, to understand what was happening, the more it felt like I was sinking into a void. The fragments of information, the whispers I'd overheard, the glimpses of strange figures in the shadows, they were all pieces of something bigger, something terrifying. I couldn't keep pretending this was just stress or paranoia. Something was happening, something that stretched beyond the boundaries of rational thought. I couldn't stop thinking about those people, the procession that had crossed my path. The cold, the energy draining from me with every step. They weren't just strangers, they weren't just passers-by. There was a purpose behind their movement, something deliberate. And it wasn't over. They were still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. But why? What did they want? What was the source of the unnatural chill that clung to me like a shadow? I needed answers. More than anything, I needed to know what was happening to me. I had no idea where to turn, but I couldn't stay paralyzed by fear. I forced myself to go out into the city again, walking through the streets as the daylight dimmed, hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything, that would give me a sense of control. As the evening grew colder, I found myself back in the park near where I'd first seen the figures. It seemed almost inevitable. The air was thicker now, the usual hum of the city fading into a suffocating silence. Even the usual sound of distant car horns and chatter seemed muted, swallowed by the thickening dark. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning the trees and the benches, the empty paths. It was quiet, too quiet. The type of quiet that makes you feel like something is about to happen, like the world is holding its breath. The further I walked, the more I felt the familiar sensation creeping up my spine, like I wasn't alone. Something was near. Something was watching me. Then, I saw him. It wasn't like the first time, when I had merely caught a glimpse from the corner of my eye. This time, I saw him fully. The same man I had noticed in the procession. He was standing by a tree, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed straight ahead, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his hood. My heart skipped a beat. I froze. For a moment, I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, if I had imagined this whole thing and was now hallucinating. But no! I knew that face. I knew that figure. The coldness that I had felt when I passed through them, it was him. The moment our eyes met, an icy shiver ran through my body. His gaze locked onto mine with unsettling intensity, and I couldn't look away. The world seemed to pause, the air pressing in on me. His eyes weren't just dark, they were empty. Like there was nothing behind them. No emotion, no life. Just an endless void. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. What was this? What was he? I knew deep down it was more than coincidence, more than a city-dwelling stranger. This wasn't just a man. This wasn't just some person walking the streets. I took another step back, my legs feeling like lead. My mind screamed at me to turn around and run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, held in place by the sheer weight of his presence. It felt like he was pulling at something deep inside me, drawing out my energy with each second that passed. The man, if he even was a man, took a slow step toward me. His movements were unnatural, too smooth, too deliberate. He wasn't walking like a normal person. It was as if his feet barely touched the ground, like he was gliding. The shadows seemed to follow him, stretching out at odd angles, distorting the light. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, a coldness spreading through my limbs. His eyes never left mine, and I felt something shifting in the pit of my stomach, something I couldn't name but knew all the same. It was the sensation of being drained, of being hollowed out from the inside. It was like he was feeding on me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get away. I had to run. But the moment I turned to leave, I saw the other figures from the procession. They weren't far off, standing in the shadows of the park, watching me. More of them. Silent. Unmoving. I was surrounded. The reality of the situation crashed down on me. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some urban legend. I had thought it was some strange occurrence, some bizarre thing that could be explained away with a little skepticism. But no! This was real. These figures, these things, they were not human. They weren't like anyone I had ever seen. And they weren't just walking through the streets. They were hunting. Hunting me. A burst of adrenaline shot through me, and suddenly I could move. I turned and ran, the sounds of footsteps and the chilling, empty air pushing me forward. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing to make sense of the chaos unfolding around me. But the fear wasn't just from being chased. It was from the realization that I wasn't the only one being watched. The others, the ones who had seen it too, the ones who had felt what I felt, they were being hunted too. This wasn't just my nightmare. This was theirs. This was all of ours. And there was no escaping it. It was becoming harder to ignore the signs. I had hoped that I could push through, that if I just kept moving, kept pretending everything was fine, things would somehow go back to normal. But they didn't. The longer I fought against it, the more it seemed like the very fabric of my life was fraying at the edges, unraveling in slow, quiet ways that I couldn't stop. I woke up that morning feeling heavier than I ever had. It wasn't just the weight of the blankets or the cold that crept into my bones. No, this felt different. It felt like my very body was dragging itself, like each muscle had been pulled taut, overused, and never allowed to rest. I could barely lift my arms. My head throbbed as if someone had replaced my blood with lead. I stumbled into the kitchen, trying to find some sort of routine to cling to. Coffee. That would help, right? I poured the water, tried to heat it up, but my hands were shaking so badly I nearly spilled the entire pot. I gripped the edge of the counter, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to steady myself. But nothing felt right. I felt disconnected from myself, like I wasn't even in my own body. It was like I was watching everything happen from the outside, unable to control it. Every movement felt slow, sluggish. I used to be able to move through the world without thinking, without even noticing how easy it was to get from one place to another. But now, it felt like the world was pushing back at me, like each step I took cost more and more. I sat down at the table, the cup of coffee barely touching my lips. My reflection in the window across the room looked wrong. There was a hollowed-out look to my face, something pale and tired in my eyes. I didn't recognize myself. But more than that, I felt it. I could feel the part of me that was slipping away. It was like there was a hole inside me, a space that used to be filled with energy, with life, and now it was empty. I forced myself to stand up and get dressed, trying to shake off the suffocating weight that seemed to cling to me. But the effort to get dressed felt like lifting boulders. The exhaustion was crushing, and it was becoming harder to deny that whatever I had experienced, whatever had been draining me, was still happening, and it wasn't stopping. I managed to get out of the apartment, but the world outside didn't help. Every step I took felt like it was taking me further from the person I used to be. The noise of the city that had once been comforting now seemed like a constant barrage. The sound of distant traffic, the murmur of pedestrians, the occasional shout, they all blended together, a cacophony of sound that made my head throb even worse. It was like I was submerged in some kind of sensory overload. I tried to focus, to push through, but it wasn't working. I felt myself becoming less and less aware of my surroundings. At one point, I stopped in the middle of the street, feeling disoriented, unsure of where I was or where I was going. People brushed past me without noticing, too caught up in their own lives to pay attention to someone who was, for all intents and purposes, fading away. I reached into my pocket, fingers trembling as I pulled out my phone. I could feel the coldness of the screen, but it was a coldness that wasn't from the outside air. It was something inside me. I was losing myself, bit by bit. The screen lit up with a message from someone I didn't recognize. A name I didn't remember adding to my contacts. "Are you okay?" The words were simple enough. But the moment I read them, my stomach tightened. Who was this? How did they know what I was feeling? I wanted to respond, to ask what they knew, but I couldn't bring myself to type the words. Instead, I just stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keys. I felt like I was losing control of everything, and yet, the more I tried to hold on to something, the more it slipped away. I couldn't focus on anything for more than a few seconds. Every task, every action seemed harder than the last, as though my very will to move was being drained. I looked up from the phone, and in that moment, I realized I wasn't alone. Across the street, near the corner, I saw him again. The man from the procession. His eyes met mine, and I felt my heart drop into my stomach. It was as though he had been waiting for me, watching me, pulling me closer with every glance. The air grew colder. The world around me seemed to slow down, to become distant and muffled, as if I was no longer a part of it. He was there, waiting, and I knew deep down that this was no coincidence. Whatever was happening to me, whatever had been taking my energy, it wasn't just a random event. This was part of something much bigger. Something that was only going to get worse. I had to get away. I had to move, to run. But as soon as I turned, my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed on the sidewalk. My body couldn't keep up with my mind. I wasn't just tired. I wasn't just exhausted. I was being drained. And the worst part? It felt like it was only the beginning. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to break away from the relentless weight that had been dragging me down. I had to find some way to regain control before it completely consumed me. The city, the streets, the constant presence of those figures, they were too much. So, I did what I thought was the only thing left to do. I locked myself inside. It was early afternoon when I returned to my apartment, though it felt like hours had passed, the exhaustion making time drag in strange, disjointed ways. I didn't bother to check the news or my messages anymore. There was no point. I just needed to be alone. I needed to rest. And if that meant hiding away, then so be it. I made sure every window was shut tight, every door securely locked. I even placed a chair under the door handle, a futile but instinctive attempt at keeping whatever was out there from getting in. But even as I did this, a cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I knew it wasn't going to help. I knew it wasn't enough. The apartment felt oddly silent, more so than usual. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I had once enjoyed. It was too still. Too empty. I could hear my breathing, the sound of my pulse thudding in my ears, but everything else felt wrong. I sat down on the couch, trying to ignore the overwhelming sensation of weariness creeping over me. I needed to rest, but as soon as I closed my eyes, the darkness behind my eyelids was filled with images of those figures. I saw them in my mind's eye, moving through the streets, their hollow eyes boring into me. I felt the coldness again, that unshakable chill that made my bones ache. My body tensed involuntarily, like I was bracing for something I couldn't see. I opened my eyes again, the apartment now more oppressive than ever. The silence was suffocating. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint. A rustling sound, like paper shifting, or the soft tap of footsteps on a hardwood floor. I froze, straining to hear. It wasn't coming from outside the apartment. The sound was coming from within the walls, from somewhere inside the very building itself. A whispering of movement that couldn't be explained away. I held my breath, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. The faint sound grew louder, more distinct. It was a knock. Someone, something, was knocking on my walls. I stood up, my legs shaky, my heart pounding in my chest. I crept toward the hallway, my ears straining, the knocking getting closer. It was a rhythmic, methodical pattern, each knock more insistent than the last. I approached the door cautiously, glancing through the peephole. No one. The hallway outside was empty. I turned back to the room, panic bubbling up inside me. I knew I had to keep it together. I had to stay calm, stay rational. But the rational part of me was already slipping away, drowned in the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken over. I moved toward the window, looking out at the street, hoping for some sign of normalcy, something to anchor me to reality. But instead, I saw the familiar shadow moving in the distance. A figure, barely discernible in the fading light. My heart skipped, my stomach turning. I wasn't imagining it. The man, the figure from the procession, was standing outside, staring up at my apartment. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow. I backed away from the window, my eyes scanning the room, searching for anything that might give me a sense of control. The knocking stopped, but the air in the apartment grew colder, heavier. My body was screaming at me to run, to get away, but I couldn't. I couldn't leave. If I did, I was sure I'd never escape. And then, the lights flickered. At first, I thought it was just a malfunction. A temporary glitch, maybe a power surge. But the lights flickered again, this time longer. The room plunged into darkness for just a moment, and when they returned, everything was different. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, more alive. The furniture in the room no longer seemed familiar, as though the space itself had been warped by some unseen force. I moved toward the switch to turn on the lamp, but the moment I touched it, the bulb exploded in a burst of light. I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell of burning filament filled the air, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection in the window, the one I didn't remember seeing before. A figure stood behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Just the emptiness of my apartment. The silence pressed in on me again, heavier than before. I turned back to the window. And there it was again, the same figure, standing across the street, unmoving, watching. I could feel his gaze like a physical weight, pressing against my chest. But the moment I looked away, the figure in the reflection was gone. This wasn't just a matter of being haunted by the procession anymore. The presence was inside my apartment. Whatever was happening to me, whatever was draining me, was no longer confined to the streets or the shadows. It had followed me home, and there was no escape. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days finally crystallized into something else, resolve. I couldn't keep hiding from this. The longer I stayed locked away in my apartment, the more I felt myself slipping. Whatever was happening to me wasn't just some random occurrence. It was a force, something real, something alive in a way that I didn't fully understand. I couldn't keep pretending that if I closed my eyes or turned my back, it would go away. If I wanted to survive, I had to find answers. And so, with that thought, I grabbed my jacket and stepped out into the night, determined to track down the source of the curse that had gripped me. As I walked through the streets of New York, the familiar hum of the city felt distant. My senses were sharp now, every sound heightened, every shadow stretching unnaturally long in the flickering streetlights. The cold was biting, but it wasn't just the temperature, it was something other, a presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia, it was an instinct, a deep, primal certainty that someone, or something, was following me. I quickened my pace, scanning the dark alleys and empty streets. The city was quieter than usual, as though it, too, had begun to sense the creeping menace in the air. I didn't know where to go, or even what I was looking for, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to find the processions, those ghostly figures that had been draining the life out of me, and figure out what they wanted. That's why I saw it. A shadow in the distance, a vague shape that seemed to shift in the dark. For a moment, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but then it moved, slowly, deliberately. It was the same figure from the procession. I froze. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to run, but something rooted me to the spot. I couldn't look away. The figure was walking toward me, its body shifting and flickering like a candle's flame in the wind. Its presence seemed to distort the air around it, making the world feel wrong, as if everything was off balance. I stepped backward, unable to stop myself. I needed to leave. I needed to get away. But as I turned to run, a chilling gust of wind slammed into me, forcing me to stop. The temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath rising in the air like smoke. The figure in the distance was getting closer now, moving faster, and its shape was becoming clearer. There was no face, no features at all, just a silhouette of shadows, constantly shifting, as though it were made of darkness itself. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from all directions. "You can't escape." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but the words froze me in place. I felt a coldness seep into my skin, a deep, paralyzing chill that numbed my limbs and clouded my thoughts. The figure reached out a hand, not a physical hand, but an extension of the darkness that seemed to materialize out of thin air. Without thinking, I raised my arm to shield myself, and that's when it happened. The moment the darkness touched me, something inside me snapped. I felt the very essence of my being, my energy, my will, drained from me, as if it were being siphoned away, sucked into the void that surrounded the figure. My legs buckled beneath me, and I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The weight of it was unbearable. It felt as if my very soul was being pulled from my body. But somehow, through the haze of exhaustion and fear, I found the strength to fight back. I didn't know how, but something in me refused to let go. I pushed against the darkness, fighting with every ounce of my being, but my body screamed for me to stop. The figure recoiled, its form flickering as if it were losing its grip on reality. It let out an inhuman shriek, a sound that seemed to pierce through my skull, before vanishing entirely, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. I was left on the street, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, my head spinning. But the feeling didn't stop. The coldness, the sensation of being drained, was still there, a gnawing presence deep within me, and I knew that the worst was far from over. I struggled to my feet, my legs weak beneath me. I had come looking for answers, but all I had found was more questions. What was this thing? What did it want with me? And more importantly, how could I stop it before it drained me completely? I couldn't give up. I couldn't let this thing take any more from me. But as I stumbled forward, determined to find a way to fight back, I realized that the night was not done with me yet. I wasn't alone. From the shadows, more figures began to emerge, their forms shifting and flickering in the dim light. The procession was far from finished. It had only just begun. And this time, they were coming for me. The street was silent except for the soft echo of my footsteps, and yet, somehow, it felt as though something was closing in. The figures, the ones I had been trying to outrun, were still somewhere in the shadows, just out of sight. I could feel them, though. It was like an itch beneath my skin, the sense of their presence never far away. I had to keep moving. I had to find answers. But where? What was I even searching for? I stumbled down the block, my mind a chaotic blur of questions and fear. And then, as if the city itself was conspiring against me, I saw them. A small group of people gathered near the alleyway, talking in hushed voices. At first, they looked like any other passerby, but there was something about their posture, something about the way they were watching the shadows, that told me they were different. They weren't just moving through the city, they were aware. Aware of the thing I had been running from. I hesitated, not sure whether to approach them, but curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know if they knew anything. Maybe they had answers. Maybe they understood what was happening. I walked toward them, my legs stiff, my heart thumping loudly in my chest. One of them, a middle-aged woman, noticed me first. Her eyes were wide with a mix of exhaustion and fear, and when she saw me approaching, she stiffened, her body tensing as if preparing for something. The others turned as well, and I felt their gazes pierce through me like they knew exactly what I had been through. "You," the woman whispered, her voice shaky. "You've seen them too, haven't you?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The weight of their knowing eyes was too much. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. "They're everywhere," another man spoke up, his voice raw, filled with a desperate edge. "Following us. Watching us. They feed on us, you know. I don't know how they do it, but every time I come near one, it's like something inside me gets pulled, like I'm being drained." His words felt like a punch to the gut, but they also resonated with something deep inside me. I had felt it too, that gnawing emptiness, the unexplainable exhaustion that followed every encounter. They weren't crazy. They weren't imagining it. But still, I couldn't stop the dread creeping up my spine. The thought that other people were experiencing this, too, that there were others who had seen what I had seen, felt what I had felt, it only made everything worse. It was no longer just my problem. It wasn't just happening to me. "It's worse than you think," the woman said, her voice quieter now, as though she feared someone might be listening. She glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows. "They don't just take your energy, they take everything. And when they're done, you're not really you anymore." I swallowed hard, struggling to maintain my composure. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just my strength they were stealing. It was my identity. My very essence. "And there's nothing we can do?" I managed to croak, my voice barely a whisper. Another man, tall and gaunt with hollow eyes, stepped forward. He had a look of someone who had seen far too much, his face lined with fear and resignation. "We tried. We all tried. But it doesn't matter. They're always there. Always watching. It's like we're just part of a game to them. And when they're finished with us, they move on to the next one." I felt my heart sink, the words ringing in my ears, a cold, suffocating weight on my chest. Was there no escape? Was this it? Was I doomed to become one of them, just another shadow, another mindless husk for whatever dark force lurked out there? The woman looked at me again, her eyes full of understanding. "You don't understand. They're not just in the streets. Not just in the alleys. They're in your head now. You've seen them. You've felt them. And they'll be with you, always." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had known it, on some level. I could feel them in my mind, in the way my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. But hearing it from someone else, seeing the terror in their eyes, it made it real in a way nothing else could. They follow you. Even when you think you're safe. They don't just want your energy. They want you gone, she continued, her voice quivering. "We all thought we could outrun it. But it doesn't work like that. You can't run from something that's already inside you." I felt the walls of my mind begin to close in. I thought I had been alone, that maybe I could still get away from it all. But now, I understood there was no escape. I was already part of it. Then what do we do? I asked, my voice barely audible. The man who had spoken before gave me a grim look. We survive. If we can. We find a way to keep living, even if we don't know how long we have left. We try to warn others, so they don't end up like us. His words felt hollow, but they were the only truth I had left to hold on to. I wasn't alone in this. And maybe that was the only thing that kept me going. But even as the group spoke in hushed tones, their words barely registering in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. That presence, that cold, oppressive sensation of being observed, was creeping closer. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And now, I had no idea if I would survive the night. We were all trapped. And there was no way out. I sat in a dim corner of my apartment, my hands trembling as I clutched the coffee cup. It had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't bring myself to pour it out. It felt like an anchor, a small piece of normalcy in a world that was unraveling around me. The others' words from earlier echoed in my mind, a relentless drumbeat of despair. They're always there. Watching. Waiting. Taking. At first, it was my energy. That gnawing exhaustion, the heaviness in my limbs, the inability to think straight, it was almost easy to explain away. Stress, lack of sleep, city life. But now, something deeper was happening. Something far more insidious. I stared at my reflection in the dark window. My face looked hollow, like I'd aged years in a single night. My eyes, usually bright and alive, were dull, their light dimmed. But it wasn't just physical. No, this went deeper. The memories started to feel distant. The laughter I once shared with friends felt muted, like it belonged to someone else. The warmth of a cherished moment, a sunset by the river, the sound of my mother's voice, now seemed unreachable, like looking through a foggy pane of glass. I didn't just feel drained anymore. I felt hollow. I slammed the coffee cup down on the table, the sharp clatter breaking the silence. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. What's happening to me? I muttered, my voice trembling. But I knew. Deep down, I understood. These things, these entities, they weren't content with just my energy. They were taking more. Stripping away the very fabric of who I was. Every smile, every tear, every shred of what made me me. They were leeching it all, piece by piece, leaving behind only a cold, numb void. I pressed my hands to my face, trying to hold on to something, anything, that felt real. But the harder I tried, the more I felt it slipping through my fingers. It was like trying to grasp water. The air around me grew colder, and I felt it again, that presence. That suffocating, oppressive weight, like unseen eyes boring into my very soul. I won't let you take it, I whispered, my voice cracking. I won't let you take me. But even as I said the words, a flicker of doubt crept in. What if it was already too late? What if they had already taken more than I realized? A single tear rolled down my cheek, and for the first time, it felt alien. Detached. Like it didn't belong to me anymore. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just energy. It wasn't just memories. They were taking my emotions. My joy. My sadness. My humanity. I leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as the weight of it all bore down on me. How do you fight something you can't see? Something that's already inside you, chipping away at everything you are? The silence in the room grew deafening, broken only by the faint sound of the city outside. But even that felt distant now, like the world was slipping further and further away. For the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. Not just physically, but emotionally. It was a terrifying, yawning emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. And in that moment, I realized the cruelest part of all. They weren't just feeding on me. They were replacing me. The library's fluorescent lights flickered faintly as I flipped through the worn pages of an ancient-looking book. The cover was cracked and smelled of damp paper, the title barely legible, Phenomena Beyond the Veil. I wasn't even sure how I found myself here, in the depths of the city's oldest archives, surrounded by shelves of forgotten texts. Desperation had driven me here. Traditional logic had failed me at every turn. Doctors and therapists dismissed my exhaustion as stress, my growing numbness as depression. But this wasn't something they could fix. I needed answers. And if science couldn't provide them, maybe the supernatural could. The words on the page blurred together as my vision wavered. Exhaustion tugged at me, but I forced myself to keep reading. A passage caught my eye, the ink darker, the tone ominous. They walk in silence, feeding on the life of those who stray too close. To face them is to confront the void, to risk the unraveling of one's soul. I froze, my heartbeat quickening. This wasn't just a random mention of spirits or apparitions. This was them. Protect thyself with light and life. They cannot abide what they cannot extinguish. The words were vague, poetic even, but they sparked something, a glimmer of hope. Light and life. What did that mean? I tore through the pages, searching for more, but the rest of the text offered little guidance. Still, it was the first hint of a solution I'd found, and I clung to it like a lifeline. As the hours passed, I gathered books and notes, scouring for anything that might help. Texts on spiritual protection, rituals, symbols, all of it was new to me, a world I never thought I'd explore. But here I was, immersing myself in the occult, hoping to find a way to fight back. One book suggested surrounding oneself with objects of personal significance, items imbued with positive memories or energy. Another spoke of creating a barrier of salt and candles, a ritual to repel malevolent forces. I scribbled notes feverishly, a mix of skepticism and desperation fueling me. I wasn't sure if any of it would work, but I had to try. As I packed up the books, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass of a nearby display case. My face was pale, my eyes sunken. The person staring back at me looked like a shadow of who I once was. But there was something else. A faint movement behind me, too quick to focus on. I spun around, my breath hitching. The aisle was empty, the faint hum of the lights the only sound. I tightened my grip on the stack of books and hurried out of the library, my heart racing. Light and life, I thought. Whatever that means, I'll find a way. Because the alternative wasn't just death. It was obliteration. Back in my apartment, I prepared for the ritual with trembling hands. The small table in the center of the room was covered with an assortment of items, a circle of salt, white candles arranged in a perfect pentagon, and a necklace my mother had given me years ago, a rare keepsake that still held meaning. The books from the library lay open around me, pages marked with frantic notes and underlined passages. I'd cobbled together a plan based on what I could piece together, a mixture of symbols and invocations meant to repel malevolent forces. I lit the candles one by one, their soft glow barely piercing the suffocating dimness that seemed to cling to the room. The air felt heavier than before, charged with something I couldn't name. "Let this light be a shield," I whispered, reciting the words I've read. My voice trembled, the incantation foreign and clumsy on my tongue. "Let it banish the dark, protect the soul within." As the final word left my lips, a low hum resonated through the room. For a fleeting moment, I felt something shift, a faint sense of relief, as though the oppressive presence around me had receded. But the moment was brief. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, growing darker, more solid. The candles flickered violently, their flames shrinking as if suffocated. A cold, hollow wind swept through the space, extinguishing 2 of the candles entirely. "No," I muttered, my heart pounding. I scrambled to relight them, but my hands were clumsy, and the matches kept snapping. The air was alive now, pulsing with an energy that felt malevolent and aware. And then I saw it. A shape, barely perceptible, standing just beyond the edge of the circle of salt. It wasn't like the others I'd glimpsed before. This one was more defined, more present. Its outline was jagged, its form shifting as though struggling to hold itself together. It moved closer, and the salt began to darken, crumbling inward like sand in a collapsing hourglass. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. I grabbed the necklace, clutching it like a talisman, but the figure didn't falter. The ritual wasn't working. If anything, I made things worse. The entity pressed forward, and as it breached the circle, a searing cold gripped me. My chest tightened, and I gasped for air, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The room spun, and for a moment, I thought I might black out. The figure loomed over me, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't just feeding now, it was stronger, more deliberate. It felt like it was claiming me. I staggered backward, knocking over one of the candles. The flame sputtered out, plunging the room into near total darkness. In the silence that followed, a single thought pierced through the haze of fear. They were adapting. Learning. My attempts to fight back hadn't weakened them. They had made them stronger. And as the entity dissolved into the shadows, leaving me trembling on the floor, I realized the horrifying truth. I wasn't just losing. I was helping them evolve. Morning crept in unnoticed, the pale light filtering through my blinds doing little to chase away the oppressive weight in the room. I hadn't slept, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt them, circling, watching. My body ached as if I'd been running for hours, though I hadn't moved from my spot on the couch. A deep, bone-weary fatigue had settled in, a kind of exhaustion no amount of rest could fix. My limbs felt leaden, my thoughts sluggish. I tried to focus, to gather myself enough to think clearly, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. Simple tasks, like making coffee or even standing up, felt insurmountable. I stumbled to the kitchen, the world tilting slightly as I moved. The air around me was wrong. Heavy. Charged. It wasn't just my apartment anymore, the feeling clung to me everywhere I went. I fumbled with the kettle, nearly dropping it as a sharp, cold shiver ran down my spine. "Get a grip," I muttered, gripping the counter for support. My voice sounded weak, foreign even. I glanced at my reflection in the microwave door and barely recognized myself. My skin was pallid, my eyes sunken with dark shadows underneath. But worse than my physical state was the creeping sensation in my mind, like a fog that grew thicker by the hour. Memories slipped away like water through my fingers. I struggled to remember what day it was or even what I'd been doing an hour ago. Something wasn't right inside me. The events of the previous night played on a loop in my head, each detail sharpening the edges of my growing despair. The ritual had failed spectacularly, and instead of finding a way to protect myself, I had somehow made the entities stronger. They weren't just taking my energy anymore. They were unraveling me, piece by piece. I sank into the couch, clutching the blanket around me as though it could shield me from the void pressing in. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, but even the thought of reaching for it felt exhausting. What was the point? Who could I even call? The thought of explaining this to anyone felt absurd. How could I describe what was happening when I barely understood it myself? The shadows in the room seemed to move of their own accord, stretching longer than they should. The edges of my vision blurred, darkened, until it felt like I was staring through a tunnel. I closed my eyes, just for a moment, hoping for some reprieve. Instead, a surge of panic gripped me as I felt the presence again. It was faint but unmistakable, like a hand hovering just above my skin. The chill crept closer, and I forced my eyes open, heart pounding. Nothing. But I could feel it. Them. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that they weren't just outside anymore. They were inside, burrowing deeper, pulling pieces of me into their void. And I didn't know how to stop it. The streets of New York had never felt so alien. The city, always alive and buzzing, now seemed muted, as though the world was slightly out of focus. Even the crowds passing by carried an eerie stillness, their faces blurred by my disoriented mind. I wandered aimlessly, unsure where I was going, the cold gnawing at my bones despite the layers I wore. My thoughts were fragments, disconnected flashes of memory that felt less like my own and more like echoes of someone else's life. And then I saw him. A man leaned casually against the wall of a coffee shop, hands in his coat pockets, a half-smile playing on his lips. He looked familiar, achingly familiar. My chest tightened as recognition hit me. It was Mark. Mark, my college roommate, the one who had always been there with a joke or an easy laugh. We'd lost touch years ago, life pulling us in different directions. But there he was, as vivid and solid as any memory I could cling to. Mark? My voice cracked as I approached, a mixture of hope and confusion swelling in me. Is that really you? He turned to face me fully, and the smile widened. Long time, huh? His voice was the same, warm, light-hearted, but something about it felt wrong. Off. How are you here? I stammered, the surrealness of the moment tightening its grip. I thought you moved to the West Coast. I did, he replied smoothly, pushing off the wall. His movements were fluid, almost too graceful. But I figured it was time to check in on an old friend. There was something in his eyes that made my skin crawl. They were too bright, too sharp, like glass reflecting light at the wrong angle. What's wrong? He asked, tilting his head. The question caught me off guard. What? You're staring at me like you've seen a ghost, he said, his tone light, but the words hung heavy between us. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't Mark, not really. His energy, his presence, it didn't feel human. It felt like the shadows that followed me, the cold that clung to my skin. Are you okay? He asked, stepping closer. I took a reflexive step back, my breath quickening. Why are you here? I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile faltered, just for a moment, and something flickered in his expression. A hint of something darker, more predatory. Come on, he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. It's me, Mark. Don't you trust me? I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this was my friend, that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. But every instinct screamed at me to run. "You're not him," I said, forcing the words out despite the lump in my throat. "I don't know what you are, but you're not Mark." His expression changed instantly. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He straightened, his movements no longer casual but deliberate, menacing. "You're smarter than you look," he said, his voice no longer familiar. It was deeper now, layered with an unnatural resonance. The shadows around him seemed to writhe, stretching out toward me. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the cold intensified. "You can't keep running," he said, his form beginning to blur, to dissolve into the darkness. "We're already part of you." And just like that, he was gone. I stood there, trembling, my breath visible in the icy air. The crowds moved around me as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. Whatever had taken Mark's face wasn't done with me. And they were right. I couldn't run forever. The encounter with Mark left me shaken to my core. The city around me buzzed with its usual indifference, but for me, the world had narrowed into something unbearable. Every shadow on the sidewalk seemed alive, every gust of wind carried whispers just beyond comprehension. I stumbled back to my apartment, locking the door behind me with trembling hands. The weight of exhaustion pressed down, but I knew sleep would bring no respite. Sitting in the dim light of a flickering lamp, I replayed the moment in my mind. That thing, whatever it was, had used his face, Mark's face. I couldn't run anymore. It wasn't bravery that stirred in me, but a kind of desperate resolve. I didn't know what these entities were, but I knew they fed on fear, on energy, on life itself. If I didn't act, I would become nothing more than a hollow shell, a host for their endless hunger. I grabbed my laptop, forcing my hands to steady, and began searching. Urban legends, occult practices, paranormal investigations, every keyword a breadcrumb leading me deeper into the abyss. Pages blurred together, stories of shadowy figures and unexplained deaths piling up like a morbid puzzle. One thread stood out, a confrontation, not flight, could disrupt them. It was a theory and proven and dangerous, but it resonated. I couldn't keep hiding, not when they had already begun taking pieces of me. As dawn crept in, pale and sickly, I shut the laptop. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, as if they were already watching, waiting. "I'm not going to be your victim," I muttered to the empty room, the words as much a plea to myself as a declaration to them. I made a plan, or what passed for one. If they came for me, I would confront them. Not with weapons, but with defiance, with whatever strength I had left. My fear had fed them long enough. The thought terrified me, but the alternative was worse, to waste away in their grasp, powerless and forgotten. As the city stirred to life outside, I took a deep breath and stood, feeling the enormity of what lay ahead. This step could be my last, but it would be mine. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear. It wasn't hope, it was the grim determination of someone with nothing left to lose. They had taken enough from me. Now, it was my turn. The cold had become my constant companion, a creeping chill that no amount of layers could fend off. It wasn't the kind of cold you could measure with a thermometer. It was deeper, more insidious, like something had hollowed out my core and filled it with frost. I spent hours combing through my plan, trying to fortify myself with the idea that action was better than surrender. But as I prepared, a grim realization began to take root. These entities, whatever they were, weren't bound by the rules of our world. They weren't predators that could be fought off or spirits that could be banished with symbols and chants. They were something else entirely. The internet was both a refuge and a nightmare, each new account I found adding to the growing pit in my stomach. People spoke of the processions, just as I had seen them, moving silently through the streets, untouched by light or sound. The stories all ended the same, the witnesses slowly fading away, consumed by their encounters. No one had stopped them. No one had survived intact. In the dim light of my apartment, I scribbled notes feverishly, connecting fragments of stories, desperate for a loophole. I tried everything: logic, prayer, even sheer willpower. But the deeper I delved, the more I understood how futile these efforts were. They didn't play by human rules. The realization hit me like a blow. I threw down the pen, my breath shallow and erratic. How could I fight something I couldn't even touch? I paced the room, my mind racing. There had to be something, some angle I hadn't considered. But the more I thought, the more the walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. I felt their presence, subtle but undeniable. "They're waiting," I whispered to no one, my voice trembling. I stopped pacing and sat down heavily on the edge of my bed. My pulse pounded in my ears, my body weighed down by the awful truth. You can't fight them. But if they couldn't be defeated, what was I supposed to do? Run? Surrender? No, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't. There had to be another way. I stared into the dark corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, daring me to keep going. Whatever came next, I had to face it head on. Even if the outcome was inevitable. The lines between reality and illusion had begun to blur. The city outside my window was the same, cars honked in chaotic harmony, people moved with hurried purpose, but it all felt distant, like a mirage I was watching through frosted glass. I sat by the window, clutching a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My thoughts were no longer my own, or at least they didn't feel that way. Whispers flitted through my mind, too faint to catch but too persistent to ignore. Were they real? Or was my mind starting to fracture under the weight of it all? I shook my head, trying to dispel the sensation, but it only grew stronger. Memories flashed unbidden, conversations with strangers who seemed too familiar, moments where time felt fractured and wrong. They weren't just taking my energy. They were reaching deeper, pulling at the fabric of who I was. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. The room felt smaller than it had before, the air thick with a pressure that wasn't physical but oppressive all the same. I paced, trying to focus on something, anything that made sense. "What do you want?" I hissed, half expecting the walls to answer. They didn't, but the silence was almost worse. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The mirror stared back at me, but even my reflection felt alien. My eyes were sunken, dark circles forming like bruises beneath them. But it wasn't just exhaustion I saw, it was something unfamiliar, something watching me from behind my own gaze. Was that even me anymore? "No," I muttered, gripping the edges of the sink. "You're losing it. Get a grip." But the thought wouldn't go away. If they could take my energy, what else could they take? My emotions? My thoughts? My memories? The idea twisted in my mind like a blade. Every decision I made, every word I spoke, was it mine? Or were they planting seeds, guiding me towards something I couldn't yet understand? I stumbled back into the main room, the shadows seeming to reach for me as I passed. A wave of nausea swept over me as my legs gave out, and I sank to the floor. the whispers returned, louder this time. They weren't words, but the meaning was clear. You are not in control. Tears stung my eyes as I clutched my head, trying to shut them out. But they weren't coming from outside. They were inside me now, filling the cracks in my mind with their presence. I couldn't trust myself anymore. I sat there, trembling, the realization settling in like a poison. This wasn't just a fight for my body, it was a fight for who I was. And I was losing. Sleep had once been an escape, a refuge from the creeping dread that followed me. Now, it had become another battleground. The first night it happened, I woke drenched in sweat, the echo of unfamiliar voices still lingering in my ears. The dream was vivid yet fragmented, a labyrinth of dark streets, where every turn led me back to the same haunting procession. Their faces blurred and shifting, their eyes like voids pulling me deeper into a black abyss. I sat upright in bed, gasping for air. The room felt wrong, like the shadows had taken on lives of their own. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, fumbling to switch it on. The light flooded the room, but it did nothing to banish the lingering cold that seemed to seep from the corners. I rubbed my eyes, willing myself to believe it was just a dream. But the unease clung to me like a second skin. The next night, it was worse. I dreamed of walking down a familiar street, yet everything about it felt distorted. The buildings loomed too high, their windows dark and yawning like mouths waiting to swallow me whole. The air was heavy, filled with a low hum that seemed to vibrate in my chest. And then I saw them. The procession moved silently, their figures gliding just above the cracked pavement. This time, I couldn't turn away. Their forms became clearer, more defined. Faces emerged, faces I recognized. Friends, neighbors, strangers I had passed on the street. Their mouths moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but their eyes were black pits, endless and consuming. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The world around me collapsed, folding in on itself like a collapsing stage. The figures surged closer, their hands reaching for me, and just as they touched my skin, I woke up screaming. The line between dream and reality had begun to erode. I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing water on my face. But as I looked in the mirror, I saw something that froze me in place, faint outlines of hands, imprints on my skin, as if someone, or something, had been holding me. I staggered back, clutching the sink for support. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. But deep down, I wasn't sure anymore. The dreams didn't stop. Each night, they grew more vivid, more invasive. They weren't just dreams, they were something else. Something pushing its way into my mind, into my very being. By the fourth night, I couldn't tell where the dreams ended and the waking world began. I would blink and find myself standing in the middle of my apartment, unsure of how I got in there. The figures from the dreams seemed to linger in the periphery of my vision, disappearing the moment I turned to look. My thoughts felt foreign, like whispers were weaving themselves into my consciousness, rewriting my reality. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, afraid to close my eyes, afraid to stay awake. The entities weren't just haunting me. They were becoming me. Desperation had turned my search into an obsession. The entities were everywhere now, their presence an ever-tightening noose around my sanity. If I couldn't fight them, I had to hide. Somewhere they couldn't reach me. I started with places I knew, libraries, forgotten corners of the city, basements of old buildings. But no matter where I went, the oppressive chill followed, lingering like a shadow. The first spot seemed promising, an abandoned subway tunnel I remembered reading about online. It was a forgotten relic of the city's past, dark and labyrinthine, its entrances sealed off from the public. I found my way in through a broken service door, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The silence inside was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow sound. I ventured deeper, convincing myself that the cold was just the damp air, the faint whispers just echoes of my own footsteps. But then, I saw them. Tattered footprints in the dust, too fresh to belong to anyone but me. I ran before I could find out who or what had made them. The second place was a derelict church on the outskirts of the city. Its towering spires loomed against the night sky like skeletal fingers. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, the pews broken and scattered. I thought, surely they won't follow me here. But as I sat in the shadow of the altar, trying to gather my thoughts, I felt it again, the unnatural chill creeping along my spine. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and saw the faint outlines of figures in the stained glass windows. The glass should have reflected only the dark street outside, but instead, it showed the procession moving in their silent, spectral rhythm. I didn't stop to question how or why. I just fled. By the time I reached the third place, a dilapidated warehouse on the waterfront, I was trembling. My legs felt like lead, my mind a tangled mess of fear and exhaustion. The warehouse was cavernous, its walls echoing every sound I made. I crouched behind a stack of rusted metal crates, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I'd found safety. And then the lights started to flicker. One by one, the overhead lamps buzzed to life, casting long, flickering shadows across the space. I froze as the shadows began to move, elongating, shifting, taking on human forms. I backed away, only to stumble into an open crate. Inside were fragments of shattered mirrors, their jagged edges glinting in the pale light. My reflection stared back at me from every shard, but it wasn't me. The eyes in the shards were black. I scrambled out of the warehouse, gasping for air, my skin crawling. Every place I sought for refuge only brought me closer to the truth. There was nowhere to hide. The entities weren't bound by walls or locked doors. They were in the air, in the shadows, in my thoughts. And every step I took away from them only seemed to bring me closer to the void. There was no escape. It wasn't a realization I came to willingly, nor one that I had fully accepted until now. I had run, hidden, fought the darkness in every possible way, but it followed me relentlessly, sinking deeper into my skin, into my mind. Every place I sought refuge only revealed more of its emptiness. The walls that had once seemed like protection were now nothing but barriers that trapped me further inside this nightmare. As I stumbled through the desolate streets, the weight of that truth pressed on me. My legs were heavy, my breath ragged, my heart no longer racing with fear, but with something worse, resignation. I reached the park near my apartment, the one I had walked through 100 times, but tonight it felt foreign. The trees were twisted, their branches like hands reaching into the sky, clawing at the clouds. The moon, usually a comforting presence, was now a cold eye watching from above. The benches that once felt safe and familiar now felt like graves. I stopped at the edge of a small pond, staring at the still, dark water. My reflection rippled in the surface, but it wasn't me. It was them. The entities. I saw their faces, lurking beneath the surface, their eyes wide and empty, staring back at me from the murky depths. No, the word barely escaped my lips. This can't be happening. But it was. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, trapped between reality and the creeping terror that threatened to swallow me whole. The wind picked up, but it didn't feel like wind, it felt like a breath, a presence behind me. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Heavy, slow, deliberate. I turned, my body frozen in place. They were there, they were always there. The procession, moving silently toward me. The figures, so familiar and yet not. Their faces were clearer now, not a blur, but a grotesque parody of the people I once knew. They moved as one, their bodies swaying, a rhythmic dance that wasn't of this world. And then I realized it wasn't just their eyes that were empty. Their souls were gone. They were shells, hollow and broken, the essence of who they had been drained away, consumed by something darker. Something like me. The coldness that washed over me wasn't from the night air. It was a freezing emptiness, something that bled into the marrow of my bones. My chest tightened as I stepped back, my hand shaking as I reached for my phone. I dialed the number for help, but there was nothing on the other end. No voice, no response. Only a dead silence. I dropped the phone. There was no one left to call. No one left to help. The procession reached the edge of the pond. They didn't speak, didn't move in any way that made sense. Their presence filled the air with a suffocating weight, a pull that was hard to describe. It wasn't a force I could see, it was a force I felt in my bones, in my blood. It was the absence of everything that made me human. I took a deep breath. There were no more choices left to me. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't even fighting anymore. I understood now, this wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a reckoning. A reckoning for everything I had ever been, everything I had ever believed. The more I resisted, the more they consumed. The more I clung to my humanity, the more it slipped away. I dropped to my knees, the cold air numbing my fingers. The ground beneath me felt like nothing more than dust, like I was sinking into it, becoming part of the void myself. And then I closed my eyes. The last remnants of who I was, of who I had been, faded away. And in that moment, the entities took everything. They took the last shred of my will, my thoughts, my soul. There was no escape. There was no victory. Just the quiet, endless void that followed them and me forever. I woke up, but I wasn't sure if I was truly awake. The world around me felt different, warped, distant, and yet unnervingly familiar. I blinked, trying to clear the fog that clouded my mind, but nothing seemed right. The shadows clung to the corners of the room like living things, undisturbed by the faint glow of the streetlights outside the window. I was still in my apartment, or what was left of it. The walls were cracked, the furniture was overturned, and the air was thick, heavy with an oppressive silence that made the space feel less like a home and more like a tomb. I tried to stand, but my legs felt as if they were no longer fully my own. They moved stiffly, like I was dragging the weight of my own body through a dense fog. The air was cold, colder than it had ever been, and there was no warmth from the window, no distant sound of the city outside. Everything felt distant. I should be dead. The thought hit me like a slap. I had seen them, the entities. I had felt them take everything from me. My energy, my emotions, my very essence. I had surrendered to them, and yet, I was still here. The silence was unbearable. I took a step forward, and the creak of the floorboards beneath me sent a shiver through my spine. But it was not the kind of shiver that came from cold. It was a shiver of dread, of uncertainty, because I knew the entities were still here, watching me, waiting. I looked around the room, desperate for some sign, some explanation. There had to be one. I couldn't have survived that. I couldn't have. I went to the window, peering through the blinds, half expecting to see the procession still walking through the streets below, their ghostly forms haunting the dark alleys. But the street was empty. The world outside seemed frozen in time. Still, the questions gnawed at me. Why hadn't they finished what they started? Why hadn't I been consumed like the others? Was this some kind of twisted punishment, a place between life and death? I backed away from the window and collapsed onto the couch, my mind spinning. I tried to concentrate, to force my thoughts into some semblance of order, but all I could think of was the emptiness that had taken hold of me. The way they had drained me. The way I had felt them, inside me. Had I been marked somehow? Was there something special about me, some fragment of resistance that allowed me to remain? Or had I become something else entirely, something less human? The weight of it all was too much. I gripped my head, squeezing my eyes shut, hoping the pressure would help clear the fog. But all I saw were flashes, blurred faces, voices that weren't mine, memories that didn't belong to me, and the presence of something far darker than I could comprehend. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't alone. The entities were still here, lurking just out of reach, just beyond the corners of my perception. And they were waiting. They were waiting for something, waiting for me. As I sat in the dim light of the room, with the weight of their presence pressing in on me from every side, I realized that I had to do something. I had to find answers. Because whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't know how long I sat there, frozen in the dim light of my apartment, staring into the nothingness that seemed to stretch on forever. But then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the whisper of fabric sliding against the floor. It was so faint that I thought I had imagined it at first. But then it came again, louder this time. I turned, heart pounding in my chest. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something was pressing in from all sides. And that's when I saw it, her. At first, I thought she was just another shadow, another trick of the light. But as she stepped forward from the corner of the room, I realized this wasn't just any shadow. Her form was dark, indistinct, her edges blurring into the darkness like oil swirling in water. The room grew colder with each step she took, until the temperature dropped so low that I could see my breath forming in the air. Her eyes, or rather, what should have been eyes, were two empty voids, dark as night and as deep as the abyss. And when she spoke, it wasn't with a voice, but with the sensation of thought itself, creeping into my mind like cold fingers. "You're still here," she said. The words weren't spoken aloud, yet they vibrated in my skull, settling like a weight inside my chest. Not like the others. Not yet, anyway. I could feel the panic rising in my throat, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, caught in the unrelenting pull of her presence. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by the force of her gaze. Why haven't you taken me?" The words were barely a whisper, but they felt loud in my ears, desperate. She smiled then, or, at least, I thought she did. The corners of her face stretched, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Her presence grew stronger, more oppressive, and I felt my mind crack open under the weight of it. "Because you are different," she said, her voice thick with something I could not place. "You are still tethered to your humanity, to the last remnants of your soul. You fight it, but it remains. We took the others because they had no resistance. They were empty. But you..." Her form shifted, a ripple through the darkness, and she was suddenly closer, so close that I could feel the cold seeping into my skin. Her presence wrapped around me like chains, suffocating, binding. You are a vessel, and vessels must be emptied. All things must return to the dark. I couldn't breathe. Her words weren't just threats, they were truths. Cold, unrelenting truths that sank into my bones, into the very marrow of my being. What are you? I managed to croak, my voice hoarse and thin. She paused, the question lingering in the air. Then, with a soft laugh, she answered, I am nothing. And everything. The room seemed to shift around me. The walls began to pulse, breathing with her words, as though they were alive. The shadows in the corners grew longer, darker, stretching toward me like claws. You are not the first, she continued. We have done this for eons. We take the energy. We take the essence. And in the end, all that remains is the void. There is no escape. There is no redemption. My mind spun. This was no longer about survival. This was no longer about anything I understood. She wasn't just an entity, she was the embodiment of something far older, far more ancient than I could ever comprehend. She was the darkness itself, the force that consumed, that destroyed. I felt my hands tremble, my vision swimming as I tried to process her words. But they made no sense. They couldn't make sense. You can't win, she whispered, her voice curling around me like smoke. You cannot stop us. We are the end. You are merely waiting. With a final, chilling smile, she stepped backward into the shadows. For a moment, I thought she might disappear completely. But instead, she lingered there like a dark stain in the air. And then, with one last whisper, barely audible, she said, We will wait. And with that, she was gone. The room felt emptier than ever. The air was thick with the residue of her presence, the weight of her words hanging in the air like a fog that refused to dissipate. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, unable to think clearly. Vessel. Waiting. Her words echoed in my mind, each repetition carving deeper into my soul. She had given me no answers, no hope, only a grim understanding of my place in this twisted game. There was no escape. There was only waiting. Waiting for them to return. Waiting for the inevitable. And in the silence that followed, I understood. I was already lost. I don't know how much time passed after she left. It could have been minutes, or hours, or maybe even days. Time, for all I could tell, had stopped, frozen in the thick, oppressive air that lingered in my apartment like a suffocating cloud. I stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the couch as my vision blurred. The weight of her words, the truth she had spoken, sank deeper with each passing second. You are different. You are a vessel. Those words reverberated in my mind, relentless, as if they were being carved into the walls of my skull. I tried to breathe, but it felt like my chest was being crushed by invisible hands. My heart thudded erratically, and I couldn't focus. The room around me seemed to stretch and distort. The corners curled in on themselves, the edges blurring until everything seemed to melt into a sickening, shifting mass of shadows. I had to move. I had to do something. I staggered toward the door, my legs unsteady beneath me. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob, but when I pulled it open, the world outside was unrecognizable. The streetlights cast long, twisted shadows, and the street itself had transformed into a desolate, dark wasteland. The sounds of the city, The usual hum of traffic, the chatter of people, were gone. Instead, there was a silence so deep it seemed to press in on me, suffocating. I stepped outside, my feet dragging through the empty streets, unsure of where I was going, if I was going anywhere at all. The world had lost all sense of time, place, or meaning. I looked around, trying to ground myself, but everything felt wrong. The buildings loomed above me, their shapes grotesque and warped, as if they had been twisted by some unseen force. The ground beneath my feet seemed unstable, as if the very earth were shifting, threatening to swallow me whole. Is this real? The thought drifted into my mind, distant and cold. I tried to grasp it, to hold on to something that felt like truth, but the harder I tried, the more elusive it became. I reached out to steady myself against a lamppost, but my hand passed straight through it as though it were made of smoke. I stumbled back, my heart racing, panic rising in my chest. The world around me wavered, rippling like water, and the shadows seemed to breathe, moving as if they had a life of their own. No, this can't be happening. It's just a nightmare. But the sensation of my own hands, cold, stiff, told me otherwise. I pressed them against my face, feeling the texture of my skin, the roughness of my hair. I'm still here. I'm still me. Or was I? I looked down at my hands again, but they seemed different. The skin was too pale, too smooth, like I was no longer fully alive. My reflection in the nearby window caught my eye, and I flinched. The face staring back at me was mine, but it wasn't. The eyes were hollow, vacant, as though all the light had been drained from them. There was no warmth, no recognition in them. Just emptiness. A stranger. My pulse quickened, a panic creeping through my veins. My breath came in shallow gasps as I backed away from the reflection. But even as I did, I knew something had changed. I didn't know when or how, but I wasn't the person I had been before. I wasn't me anymore. What have they done to me? The question echoed in my mind, but there was no answer. Just the sickening feeling that I had become something else. I reached out, touching the walls around me, but the surface felt alien. Nothing felt familiar anymore. Not the buildings, not the streets, not even my own body. Was I ever truly human? The thought clung to me, suffocating me, dragging me deeper into the abyss. Did I ever have a soul to begin with? The cold, dark void that stretched out before me felt endless, consuming. I was no longer sure if I was trapped in a nightmare or if I had slipped into some other realm entirely, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. Where I was no longer me, but something else. Something that had forgotten what it meant to be human. The world around me continued to shift, warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I reached out, but there was nothing to hold on to. No anchor. No way to ground myself. I don't exist anymore, I thought, as the ground seemed to fall away beneath my feet. I'm not real. None of this is real. The darkness reached for me then. They reached for me, their cold fingers curling around my mind, my body, pulling me into the void. And as I was swallowed by the shadows, I realized I had lost everything. My sense of self, my humanity, my place in the world, all of it was gone. I was nothing. And I was everything. And I would never escape. For a moment, the chaos receded. The oppressive pressure in the air lightened just enough for a single, fleeting moment of clarity. I stood still, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, but I was aware again. My hands gripped the cold, jagged edge of the building's concrete wall, grounding myself to something, anything, real. The swirling darkness that had threatened to consume me now seemed distant, almost muffled, as if a thin veil had dropped over the nightmare. I was here. I was still here. I hadn't completely lost myself, not yet. Focus. The word cut through the fog of my mind like a sharp blade. I had to think. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to make sense of this madness, to escape this nightmare that was no longer confined to my dreams. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe deeply. The steady rhythm of my breath was the only thing I could control in this sea of uncertainty. Think. The words of the dark entity, the one who claimed to know what I had become, echoed in my head. You are a vessel. You are the bridge between two worlds. A vessel. A bridge. I remembered her eyes, pale, unblinking, filled with something ancient. She had given me an answer, but it was a riddle. A riddle that had slipped from my grasp like sand through my fingers, no matter how desperately I had tried to hold on to it. But now, in this strange clarity, I could hear it again, her voice faint, like a distant whisper in the wind. You're not meant to fight them. You are one of them now. You can never leave. One of them. The words slid across my thoughts like ice. I wasn't sure whether they terrified me or if they had unlocked some truth buried deep within me. But I couldn't let go of the nagging sensation that, somehow, I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be this. I opened my eyes, my hands trembling. The shadows still twisted around me, flickering at the edge of my vision, but they seemed to pause, watching, waiting. I could almost hear them, breathing, waiting for me to falter. But I couldn't falter. Not yet. Escape. I have to escape. I looked around, my eyes searching the distorted landscape. Everything had changed. The familiar had warped into something alien, something dangerous. The city no longer felt like home. It felt like a prison, a vast, endless trap where time and reality had lost all meaning. But I could find a way out. I had to. I stumbled forward, taking cautious steps. The streets seemed to narrow, the buildings pressing in on me. The more I walked, the more the feeling of being trapped tightened around my chest, like invisible chains dragging me towards something I didn't want to face. There was no exit. Not here. Not now. I stopped, gasping for air, my mind spinning. My feet carried me in circles, aimless. The fear that had consumed me before began to rise again. It clawed at my chest, pulling me back into the depths of despair. But there was something else now. A glimmer of something cold and distant. A choice. I could feel it, a fragile thread of understanding cutting through the panic, through the darkness. If I could find the strength to reach beyond myself, beyond what I had become, I might have a chance. I might be able to break free. But was it even possible? Could I ever be free? I took another step, my heart racing. The path in front of me seemed to shift, folding in on itself like a labyrinth, but I was determined. I had to find the way out. I had to remember who I was before this all began. I had to cling to the last fragments of my humanity. But with each step, I felt myself unraveling further. My body was fading, my mind flickering in and out of focus. I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on to the last remnants of clarity. There was a noise, a distant sound, faint but unmistakable. A voice, calling from the depths of the darkness. I froze. The voice. It was mine. Not the one I knew, but something else. Something wrong. And then I understood. There was no escape. Not anymore. The world around me blurred again, the shadows closing in, and the cold truth sunk in. There was nowhere left to run. I wasn't trying to break free anymore. I was trying to survive. And even that might not be enough. The weight of everything crashed down at once. My body was trembling, my mind shattered into countless fragments, each piece racing in a different direction. There was no longer a line between what was real and what was imagined, if they had ever existed as separate things at all. I had become something else, something that could not be undone, something beyond the reach of the life I had once known. I stood at the edge of that precipice, my heart hammering in my chest, my breath ragged, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The shadows pressed in from all sides, their shapes growing more distinct, their forms flickering in and out of existence like broken fragments of a dream. And then I saw it. A figure, moving through the darkness, slow and deliberate. It wasn't human, it couldn't be. The way it moved, the way the air seemed to ripple around it, it wasn't like anything I had ever encountered before. It didn't make sense, but it was there. Watching me. Watching. It took me a moment to realize I wasn't alone. In that dark expanse, where time had become irrelevant and the air was thick with dread, it was as if everything I had known, the world I had once walked through so confidently, was slowly dissolving. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of defeat rising in my throat. I could still feel it, that presence, pressing against me from every angle. The figures, the shadows, they weren't just haunting me, they were inside me now. Their touch had invaded my very being, transforming me into something other. They didn't care to kill me. They wanted me to break. To lose myself entirely. I wanted to fight. I wanted to yell at them to leave me alone. To reclaim whatever fragments of humanity I had left. But it wasn't that simple. I looked around once more, at the endless labyrinth of distorted streets, at the void where there should have been sky. Nothing was real anymore, and everything was real. There were no answers here, only questions that spiraled into infinity. The entity, the one who had warned me before, appeared again in my thoughts, and I could hear its words like a sickening whisper, "You cannot return to what you were. You are ours now." A sick realization began to seep into my mind like poison. There was no escape. No turning back. No future waiting for me at the end of this road. I had become part of this world of shadows and entities. A vessel. A bridge. A being caught between two realms, neither fully alive nor truly dead. I was theirs. And, in that moment, I understood that my fight had never been about survival. It had been about acceptance. About letting go. There was no salvation. No rescue. There was only this. A never-ending existence, caught between two forces that I could neither understand nor escape. I felt my consciousness slipping, my thoughts becoming more distant, more fragmented. But as they faded, something else emerged, a strange, twisted clarity. I knew the path ahead. I knew what was coming. The future was already here, and it wasn't mine to control. It was theirs. And I would walk it for as long as they willed. The silence was suffocating. It pressed in on me, wrapping its cold fingers around my throat, tightening with every breath I tried to draw. My heart pounded relentlessly in my chest, but there was no escape. No place left to hide. For the first time since it all began, I truly understood the scope of what had happened. The weight of the realization settled over me like a heavy, dark shroud. The entities were not simply ghosts. They were not merely the shadows that haunted the streets at night. They were far more insidious than I had ever imagined. They were a part of me now, not just in body, but in mind. I could feel them crawling beneath my skin, slipping into my thoughts, twisting the fabric of my consciousness. Their presence was no longer a distant thing, something I could ignore in the fleeting moments when I wasn't consumed by terror. They were inside me. They were in my very thoughts. I staggered down the street, my steps unsteady. My surroundings blurred and flickered. The familiar faces of the city, once so comforting, now appeared as strange, half-formed phantoms. The buildings loomed over me, distorted and unfocused, as if they too were trying to tear themselves free from the constraints of reality. The world was crumbling, but what terrified me most was the realization that the destruction wasn't just around me. It was inside me. In the deepest, most hidden corners of my mind, they were there. Their whispers were constant now, filling the empty spaces where my thoughts used to be. They knew everything. They could see everything. I had no secrets from them anymore. "You are ours," the voice echoed in my mind again. It was not a distant sound, but a part of me, like a pulse in my very veins, an unshakable truth I could no longer deny. I pressed my hands to my head, trying to block it out. To stop the voices, the relentless thoughts that weren't mine. The darkness that filled me, consumed me, until there was nothing left. But it didn't stop. It couldn't. The entities weren't just draining my energy, my emotions, they were feeding on my mind, unraveling my sense of self, erasing the lines between who I had been and what I had become. I had been a vessel for them, but now, I realized, I was becoming part of them. Not just physically, not just emotionally, but in the very essence of my mind, my soul. I stumbled into an alley, the cold air biting into my skin. The world was spinning. Reality itself was disintegrating. I couldn't trust anything I saw anymore. The shapes around me shifted, their forms melting into something unrecognizable. Faces that had once been human, once been mine, now twisted into grotesque mockeries of life. I could feel them watching me. Everywhere. They were in the shadows, in the cracks of the walls, in the empty spaces between my thoughts. Their presence was inescapable. And in that moment, I knew that this creeping, endless terror was not something I could outrun. Not anymore. The entities weren't just outside. They had infiltrated every corner of my being. They had crawled into my thoughts, my memories, and were feeding off my fear. The very thing that had once kept me grounded, my humanity, was slipping away, piece by piece. I closed my eyes, clinging to the last shred of my own mind. There had to be something I could do. Something, anything, to fight back. But no matter how hard I tried to think, my thoughts betrayed me, slipping through my fingers like smoke. I am not me anymore. The thought came unbidden, unwelcomed. But it was true. I was losing myself to them. And with that, I understood the final truth. There was no salvation. There was no escape from what I had become. The entities were not an external force anymore. They had become a part of me, and I had become a part of them. There would be no redemption. No return. Only a never-ending descent into a world of shadows, of lost souls, where reality was just a distant, fleeting memory. I was their vessel, their bridge, forever caught between two worlds, neither alive nor dead, neither human nor whatever I was now. And as I sank deeper into the darkness, I realized the final horror. There was no end. only an eternal beginning. It was too late. The words echoed in my mind, louder than any scream I could have made. It's too late. There was no turning back. The realization hit me like a wave, crashing over me with such force that I almost couldn't breathe. I had been running, fighting, desperately clinging to fragments of what I had been, but it was all in vain. Every step, every thought, had only led me further into their grasp. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating until I could hardly move. My legs were heavy, my body trembling with the exhaustion that came not just from physical depletion, but from the deep, gnawing emptiness inside me. I had felt it before, the gradual loss of energy, the slow unraveling of myself, but now it was overwhelming. It was final. Too late. I stumbled forward, my vision blurred. The city around me was a chaotic mess of twisted, shifting forms. Buildings that I had once known were now unrecognizable, their shapes warped and fluid, bending at impossible angles. Faces of strangers morphed in the shadows, eyes following me with a hunger that went beyond human. The air was thick with the taste of cold, suffocating fear. I tried to focus, tried to grasp onto something real. Anything. But everything felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The world, my world, was no longer my own. I wasn't in control anymore. I was a passenger in a body that wasn't entirely mine, lost in a mind that was no longer my own either. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to block out the whispers. They were there again, louder now, like a swarm of insects crawling through my skull. You're one of us. You always were. The voice was not external, not something I could escape. It was my voice, too, intertwined with theirs, suffocating my own thoughts. I had tried so hard to find a way out, to find something that could make sense of it all, but now it was clear. There was no salvation. There never had been. The entities weren't just around me, they were inside me, feeding off everything I had once been. They had torn apart the very essence of who I was, until I could no longer remember the person I had been before. Too late. My breath hitched in my chest, but there was no panic anymore. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to resist. The fear, the terror I had been carrying with me for so long, began to fade, replaced by a cold, hollow sense of inevitability. I was no longer me. I had become something else, something darker, something that had crossed the line between living and dead, between reality and the void. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I staggered into the street, my vision blurring again, the world around me spinning, collapsing into itself. But in that moment, amidst the swirling chaos, I felt it, the final surrender. The world no longer mattered. The street, the city, the buildings, none of it was real anymore. There was only this endless, consuming darkness that had swallowed me whole. The entities were with me, inside me, and there was no escape. It's too late. The words no longer stung. They were a final, cold acceptance of the truth. I had been a fool to think there was a way out, that I could outrun this fate. There was no end. Only this, an eternal descent into the unknown, into the hollow emptiness that was now my existence. I had become one of them. And in the depths of the endless night, I could hear their voices, calling me into the darkness, urging me to join them. To lose myself completely. It was too late. And so, I did. Fear had always been a shadow, lurking just beyond my reach, creeping closer with every step I took until it consumed me whole. But now, fear wasn't just a feeling. It was the very air I breathed, the ground beneath my feet, the pulse in my veins. It surrounded me like a storm, one that had no end and no escape. I could feel it closing in on me, this gnawing, suffocating pressure, tightening like a noose around my chest. The weight of inevitability crushed me. I am nothing now. The thought echoed in my mind, but it was not my thought anymore. It was theirs, one of the entities, slipping deeper into my consciousness, mingling with the fear, becoming one with it. Every step I took felt like I was sinking into quicksand, each movement slower, more labored, as though the very act of existing was becoming a struggle. I could see nothing but shadows, shadows that stretched out like fingers, trying to grasp me, pulling me into the void. The world was breaking apart, splintering like glass under pressure, and I was at the center of it, helpless, powerless. The city around me had dissolved into a nightmare, a twisted, fractured version of itself, where nothing made sense and nothing was real. I reached out to touch a lamppost for support, but my hand passed through it like it was made of smoke. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung in the air. There was no one to hear me. There was no one left to listen. The world had stopped, frozen in place, suspended in the empty space between life and death. And then I heard it, the sound that had been slowly building in my chest, the tremor in the pit of my stomach that had finally manifested into words. You are ours. It was not a voice. It was a presence, a dark weight that pressed down on me from all directions, 1,000 whispers intertwining into one unified message, one final truth. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking, my heart racing. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was no longer my own. I was trapped, cornered by something I could not see, something that had always been here, waiting for this moment. Waiting for me to break, to finally realize the truth. I had always been theirs. Always. From the very beginning, I had been a vessel, a bridge between the living and the dead, a fragile line that had finally snapped under the weight of their hunger. The shadows closed in tighter, pulling the last remnants of light from the world, until there was nothing left but blackness. My own body felt distant, as though I was no longer truly in it, but watching it from afar, detached. I couldn't even feel my heart anymore, couldn't hear my breath. All that remained was the crushing, relentless darkness. And in the silence, the final truth struck me with a cold, final certainty. This is it. This is where it ends. I was no longer alive, not truly. The entities had drained me of everything they needed. They had taken my energy, my emotions, my thoughts, my soul. They had consumed every part of me until there was nothing left. I am nothing. A deep, hollow laugh echoed in the depths of my mind. It was not my laugh. It was theirs. I could feel them now, inside me, entwined with my essence. I wasn't a human being anymore. I was a vessel for them, an extension of their will. There was no turning back, no escape. They had claimed me, and I had become part of them. Forever. The world around me continued to dissolve into nothingness, the walls of reality breaking apart like dust in the wind. The last remnants of who I had been flickered out like a dying flame, consumed by the storm of fear, swallowed by the endless night. And then, there was nothing. No thoughts, no fear, no light, only the eternal, suffocating darkness, where the only truth remained. I had become one with the entities. This was my fate. And there would be no end. Everything had changed. The world no longer resembled anything I had once known. The cities, the streets, the faces of people, they were all distant echoes of a life I no longer remembered, a life that now seemed like someone else's. Somewhere, deep inside, I knew I had once been a person who had felt hope, fear, joy, and sorrow. But now there was nothing left of that. I wasn't sure when it happened, when the shift occurred, but I knew it had. There was no one moment that I could pinpoint, no definitive change that I could identify. It was gradual, like the fading of a dream, slipping away piece by piece, until the dream was gone, and all that was left was an empty shell. I could feel it in my skin, in my bones. My own reflection, if I dared look, was foreign to me. The eyes that stared back were not mine. They were cold, empty, devoid of anything human. A hollow mask that could move, speak, breathe, but no longer felt anything. My heart still beat, but it was a mechanical pulse now, detached from any real emotion or life. My breath was shallow, automatic. I no longer needed to struggle to survive, because survival had ceased to matter. I felt the entities with me at all times. They had settled inside me, as they had done with so many others before me. At first, there had been fear, terrifying, bone-deep fear. But now, the fear was gone. It had become something else, something far worse. It was acceptance. It was knowing that I had become a part of them, and they had become a part of me. The barrier between myself and them had dissolved. There was no more I and them. There was only us, a collective consciousness, a hive of hollow souls drifting together in the dark. I had become a puppet to their will, a vessel for their hunger. I could still feel traces of the person I had been, flickering in the corners of my mind, but those remnants were fading, slipping further away with each passing moment. The fear that had once consumed me, the fear of losing myself, of being taken over, had been replaced with a strange, numb acceptance. What was I now? I wasn't sure. But I didn't need to be sure anymore. I had shed the need for identity, for purpose, for meaning. I had become nothing. But in that nothingness, there was peace. A kind of hollow peace. No more questions, no more struggle. No more pain, no more hope. Just existence. A quiet, infinite existence in the dark, where time no longer mattered, where nothing mattered. The city around me was empty, too. The streets had no people, no life, no sound. It had all been swallowed up by the void, the same void I now inhabited. Everything that had once been familiar was now a twisted reflection of what it had been, like a shattered mirror. But I was no longer concerned with the world outside. What did it matter? I had lost my place in it long ago. The streets were empty, but so was I. The emptiness within me matched the emptiness outside. There was no division anymore. I wandered through the darkened streets, but I no longer walked with purpose. I no longer cared where I went, because wherever I went, I would always be the same. Forever. A shell. A creature of the void. I had changed. I had become something else. Not human, not truly alive, but not dead either. I was a shadow now, a fragment of what had once been, lost in the dark, adrift in the endless abyss that had swallowed both me and the world I had known. This was who I was now. This was who I would always be. And I didn't even care anymore. The darkness had finally become my world. There was no longer any distinction between myself and the void I inhabited. Time felt irrelevant. Minutes, hours, days, they no longer had meaning. I wandered through the ruins of my own mind, searching for something I could not name, something I could no longer remember wanting. But then, it came. The truth. the final piece of the puzzle that had eluded me for so long. I had always thought that these entities, these shadows that had plagued me, were just that, spirits, ghosts, fleeting fragments of something once human. I had imagined they were isolated, a collection of lost souls caught in the web of their own unfinished business. But I had been wrong. They were not just ghosts. They were part of something far older, far more insidious. They were fragments of a greater consciousness, a collective, an ancient, cosmic force that had been here long before humans and would remain long after. The entities were not simply wandering the world, they were feeding. They were consuming the essence of life itself, feeding off the energy of all beings, but especially those who dared to glimpse the truth. And they were patient. They were methodical. They had been watching us, waiting for the right moment, slowly bleeding the life from us, drawing us closer to their grasp. But it wasn't just energy they sought. No, it was something more profound. They craved our souls, the very core of our being, the part that made us who we were. And now, I had become one of them. I had lost myself completely. They had consumed me, my thoughts, my emotions, my fears, my will. But unlike the others before me, I had been chosen. I wasn't just a victim of their hunger, I was now a part of their eternal existence. I could feel it, this new, terrible connection between us, a bond that went beyond life and death. My essence was forever intertwined with theirs. I understood now that the ghosts, the shadows, the entities, they weren't just passing through. They were part of a much larger, much darker purpose. They were the harbingers, the messengers, the extensions of something vast and ancient that moved through the universe, draining, consuming, replacing. I was no longer me. I was a tool of that force, an extension of its will. And there was no escape. No release. No return to what I had once been. I could still feel it, their presence, inside me, around me, part of me. It was not just in my mind, it was in my soul. I had become a vessel for them. I was not the only one. There were others like me, hidden in the shadows, walking the streets, drifting through the remnants of a world that no longer existed. The world had changed, but not in the way I had imagined. This was not the end of everything, it was the beginning of something far worse. A cycle that would never end, a force that would never die, feeding on the life of every living being, stretching out into the stars, into the far reaches of the universe. And now, I was part of it. There would be no more fear, no more struggle. There was only the endless silence, the eternal dark, and the knowledge that I would never be free. This was my fate. This was what I had become. And so, I faded. Slowly. Not into death, but into something worse. I was the end, and I would never leave. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.